The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
So what exactly is this global virtual painting event called Plein Air Live? Well, first, it's kind of like our Plein Air convention. It's people like you who are interested in growth, working on themselves and on their painting and how you show up in the world.
This year's amazing faculty includes the incredible Jill Carver, landscape legend Scott Christensen, the incomparable Kevin McPherson, Catherine Statz, Joe Paquette, and many more to come.
Let's make our own personal growth a priority and be one as a plein air community worldwide. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines, and we're pulling out some classics for you. This is a video that Lillidahl did many, many years ago when Johnny Lillidahl was producing videos and still alive. And this is a classic, a true classic with David Leffel. It's called The Art of Painting. Enjoy.
Okay, since the first demonstration I did, we did a still life going across the canvas, left to right. I thought I'd set up something that had more of a movement of front to back, just to give you that kind of an idea. In any case, what I try to do is set up something in a sense that starts here with this bunch of grapes and then up to the turnip and then the vase back here with the flowers, to have that kind of a semicircle movement. And starting out, just with drawing the idea of the painting, so that instead of really drawing anything specifically in terms of the objects, but really drawing the idea of the painting, and then putting the objects on top of the idea. Similar to having a idea for a book, that you have the entire theme of the book and you use your characters and plots, subplots to illustrate the theme, and how many characters and subplots you put into the main theme becomes the pace of how fast or slow you get from page 1 to page 2. So that the same thing in painting, that how many characters in terms of colors, values, textural changes becomes the pace of the entire painting. The more things that the painter gives you to look at, the slower the pace of the painting. So that everything you put in your painting has a significance to it, that everything, or should have a significance rather than being haphazard, because it'll be read a particular way, just like, as I said, a novel or an essay is read, then your painting is read by how many brush strokes, the kind of brush strokes you use, how many changes. So everything you give the viewer to look at will cause them to stop or go at a certain rate of speed from one place on the canvas to the next place. So when you're setting up a still life, that's some of what you're considering as you're placing objects down, is to really do it for the pace of the picture, whether you're aware of it or not. You're setting up. Of course, the more you're aware of anything, the more you can control it. So that it sort of behooves each painter to understand the whole setup, and rather than just using objects and moving them around, but to have some grasp of the whys and wherefore of picture making. So learning to paint is not only about painting things, but getting a sense of the whole painting and becoming sensitive to the whole painting, and the significance of what to put in and what to leave out. You see, so this, I'm trying to get this to come around, and using the different objects to bring your eye to a particular place in the painting. It's like stringing beads. The painting has kind of a string beads to it, and I'm putting the objects, just as you would be putting the objects, on those beads to form a pathway to get from one place to the other. So everything will be on this kind of a movement. And then just getting a sense of the objects as, in terms of shapes, more abstract, thinking about it more abstractly. To go from here, then there's the little white onion for a change of pace here, and then so forth. And ultimately, the flowers. So that would be the main pathway. And you see how just drawing that right away creates the sense of movement. So the other part of painting, the most important part in terms of learning, is learning to use your brush in a particular way, learning to hold the brush properly so that you can make arm movements rather than finger movements. And so that you have a sense of painting and making brush strokes rather than drawing, you see. So to be relaxed and just have the control so that you're thinking brush strokes. You're always thinking brush strokes rather than drawing. That's very important to find out the difference between drawing and painting, so that no matter what you do with your brush, you're thinking painting strokes. The brush has a certain width, dimension, and you're using it to apply paint, manipulate paint on the surface. So you have to think in terms of masses and planes rather than line and tone. So to learn to paint, it's a matter of cultivating, thinking like a painter, so that you have to see as a line, have to see mass, shape, values, rather than drawing line and as a painting tone. If you think drawing, then you can't learn how to paint. So part of it is finding out the difference. So holding the brush, keeping your arm relaxed, making paint strokes, regardless of, if you're painting round grapes, but you're still making brush strokes. You're not thinking, I have to go around. I mean, sometime that might be appropriate, but it's how to make shapes, simple shapes, and then make those shapes into something more complex or more particular, starting from general and then going from general to particular. So that the only technique one has to really learn in painting is the technique of holding the brush properly and making paint strokes from the shoulder, very relaxed, you see, so that everything's just feeling the paint and just the delight in the paint and not thinking drawing, but this is a whole shadow plane, you see, whatever it is. So it's getting that into your nervous system of making a whole plane, and to think of the shadow, when you're doing the shadow, as a wall that the light can't get past the shadow. So you're doing shadow, but you're doing it as like a wall. The light can't get past the shadow. So it's like rigid to support the light. So whatever this shadow is, you see. So much of light, so much. So there's a logic to everything there's a logic to everything you do that unifies the picture. So part of it is seeing the unity. So that each time you paint, you don't have to relearn the paint, how to do it. You see that once you can paint one thing, you can paint anything. Part of it is deciphering what makes each thing look like it does. And each time you go over something, do it with the same consideration that you did it the first time. So using those values of darks to, so since we want everything to lead to the back, the idea is to keep everything in the foreground here relatively dark, create more of a shadow so the light works further back in the painting. Now there are two things to consider in learning how to paint, and one is how do you get to paint the objects that you're painting to look at how to get the objects you're painting to look like the objects that are in front of you, which is, I think, what most people start out thinking when they think about learning to paint. And the other is learning to paint by getting a sense of the paint quality of your brush, the paint quality on your brush, so that you learn to manipulate paint, so that if you learn to just get a feeling of the paint and what it feels like, what it looks like, then you'll be able to paint anything in terms of the objects that you want to paint, because you'll be able to control the paint, what's happening at the end of your brush. So generally my advice would be to focus on the paint first, and almost secondarily focus on trying to make something look like what it looks like, or maybe I should say, more important than not to neglect one over the other, so that when you're trying to learn how to paint, you're thinking and feeling the paint on your brush. So a good working procedure is, starting with your darks to set a value for your background, and then saving your lights to last. The darks give you the structure of the painting and keep the composition in place. So you try to set your darkest darks in the foreground, and then use that to find background value. And then, as I said, save your light for last. So the light is the foreground, and the shadows, your darks, regardless of where they are in the picture plane. And your darks, or what you decide is background, could be the hair on a person, the hair, garment. So really not thinking in terms of foreground and background, in terms of picture plane, but foreground and background in terms of aesthetics. So that after you've set up something, or while you're setting up a still life or a model, you are thinking what you want to be seen in the picture and what is background that you don't want to be seen. So that the more things you know or can determine as you're setting up a still life or a figurative painting or even looking at a landscape, the more things you can know about how you want the picture to come out, the better it'll come out. The more you're just winging it, then you're in a very difficult position, because if you don't know where you're going, you usually wind up someplace else. So the more you know where you're going, the more comfortable, the better the painting. Putting light on, so just getting a nice background. One thing, that the more paint you have on your surface, the easier it is to paint. So just getting stuff down in the beginning, just to have something to work into. So the more paint you use, or the easier it is to paint. The less paint you have on your surface, or a dry surface, in a sense, you have to work much harder to manipulate the paint. It's much easier to work into paint, a nice paint surface. Okay. Beforehand. Doctor. Or here.
David, could you tell us why do you prefer always flat backgrounds?
Well, essentially for the reason that the and actually I should also say that I don't always do, an absolute flat background. But the reason to do backgrounds a particular way depends on what you have taking place in the foreground. I mean, in a sense, you can see this background still and may wind up, with a lot of texture in it, but the background by definition should be background, so that the busier you make it, the less it really is in fact background. It becomes foreground. And I think one of the reasons that students, actually saying student, we're in a sense all students, but one of the reasons for people make the background, do a lot of stuff in the background, is because the foreground isn't compelling enough in the finished painting, so that once you've done the foreground, you feel unsatisfied with the result of your painting, then there's nothing much left to do except to go into the background and do more work in the background. And what happens is that you lose background, the background becomes part of the foreground because it's too busy. So painting is, you can also explain it, painting is a series of relationships. And so you have the relationship of thick paint and thin paint. You have a relationship of hard edges and soft edges, color against colorlessness. So the same would hold true for foreground and background, so that if everything is foreground, then nothing is foreground, you see. So you need something to establish a relationship, what's foreground, what's background, both aesthetically and in terms of the picture plane. So by definition, a background is something you don't look at in the painting. If you look at it, it's foreground. You understand? So the most important thing is to determine, as I said earlier, what you want the person to see and what you don't want them to see in your mind, so that you have a sense of the foreground and background of your painting. So you know the whys and wherefores, why you're picking certain objects, what you're going to put into the picture, what you don't want to be seen, what you want the viewer to notice. Again, just like a magician, you're conducting the painting and getting the people to look here, don't look there, kind of an attitude. Just the same in music, you have soft passages and loud passages. the different coloration of the instruments. So the same language and principles hold true in painting. You understand?
David, when you lay in your objects, do you choose one color or do you use several different colors?
You mean in the beginning of the painting?
Yes.
Starting a painting? I use at least two colors in starting the paint. Usually an umber and a blue, either a burnt umber and phthalo blue or ultramarine blue, but usually a blue and an umber to start out the paint. It just gives you a chance to, without drawing, to get a feeling of the coloration of what you're doing. The other thing I do, and you can do, is to change your brush pressure so you get thicker and thinner passages as you're going along to change color. So you can get a sense of the different shapes and how they relate to one another. It's so you don't just not to get lost in with the grapes you have the highlight and the transparent light, and to get a sense of grapes look very much like painting hair, where they basically have an overall value rather than a pattern of light and shadow. And here you could almost do you could call a wet glaze, where the white is wet, and then you could just float some blue into it, some of that bluish blush, into the white, to get some of the marking of the grape. But trying to keep the value very close together. And there's even a bit of the reflected light, and then there's also the richness of the light coming through it to give it that grape-like quality. But make brush strokes. Try to, as I said before, whatever you do it so you're making a brush stroke. No matter how big or small, you are not trying to draw, but you're trying to move paint from one place to another and deposit the paint. You understand? Try to, if nothing else, try to control the paint and think in terms of brush strokes. Picking up paint, say, and see, so big or small, you're making a very firm, very definite mark, with your brush, no matter how delicate, but trying to control so that you're always making theoretically, you're always making nice brush strokes.
David, do you ever use sables?
No, I don't. Only when I'm trying to do watercolor, which I do every so often to prove to myself I still can't do watercolor. It's really hard for me to do watercolor. I don't think like a watercolorist, so that even when I'm doing watercolor, I'm still trying to get the paint to be thicker, which of course is not really what you want to do when you're doing a watercolor. So I don't do enough to change my way of thinking, enough to really get into a watercolor type mindset to do watercolor, so they always come out. They always come out not looking like watercolors. I don't know enough about the medium, and I haven't taken enough time. Similar, when I was, for a short period of time, I tried pastels, and it's really learning what the medium will do. So the same if you want to become if I would really feel like becoming a watercolorist, then the thing you have to do, the same as with oil, you have to practice paint enough so you get a feeling of how much water to pigment. It's not so much, if you can think of those terms and apply it to painting in oil, that what I said earlier in terms of learning to paint, with oil, you want to learn what the brush will do, how much paint you have on the brush, your surface, getting a feeling of that kind of thing. So you'd be learning how to paint. So if you can understand that, the same analogy in terms of me learning watercolor or anybody else, is you have to learn the actual paint itself, how much water to pigment, the kind of paper, the absorbency of the paper, how different pigments work, you see. So it's the same thing. So for you or anyone to learn to paint in oil, you want to learn what you can do with the brush. You understand? What the brush will do for you, what the paint will do for you. You understand? Maybe that, if you could think like that, get that idea, would help you learn to paint in terms of seeing that painting is different than just making something look like something. You want to know how you could cover something. Does that make it clearer? So if you wanted to learn pastel, you'd have to learn how about paper, kinds of paper, how absorbent the paper is, things of that nature, to learn to do pastel. You'd have to get a sense of the material, in other words. To learn anything in painting, you have to get a sense of the material.
David, what are the benefits of using the Merage medium compared to other mediums that are available?
Well, that's an interesting question. Essentially, it gives you, but it would be true of any medium that your favorite could be, stand oil and turpentine liquid. Any medium would be, the reason to use it would be that it allows you to manipulate the paint that in a very comfortable fashion. So before I used Maragé, I used to paint with Copal painting medium when it was real Copal. Now it's plastic. It's called Copal medium, but it's really some kind of plastic polymer medium. And I liked it, the Copal painting medium. While I was using Copal, I was making Maragé and bringing it over to the Art Students League and selling it to the students as a way of making money. And I don't know why I refused to actually use the Maragé I was making, kind of a stubborn streak or rebellion. Anyhow, what happened was one day I was doing a painting and I ran out of Copal. In the middle of the painting, I didn't feel like running down to the art supply store and interrupting myself, so I just took some of the Maragé that I had on order, for school, and I just started using the Maragé, and I liked it. I liked the way it worked. It allowed me to manipulate the paint very comfortably. It's good, thick paint, thin paint, its drying properties. So I was kind of stuck, hooked on the Maragé. But any medium you use, you're really doing it so that you can paint very comfortably. That your handwriting, you can overpaint, paint as long as you want. That's really the reason for using any medium. And since Maragé basically does that, there's no reason for me not to use it. Okay, so back to art. What was that question?
Oh, whether you start on one object and
Oh,
finish,
yes,
or
I remember.
how do you move
Yeah,
around?
whether to finish something as you go along. You should finish the painting. My feeling is you should always do the finished painting. The reason for doing a highlight here or there, is rather than waiting till the end of the painting or building up to the finish, doesn't quite seem logical to me. Everything I try to do it as a finished brushstroke, the background notwithstanding. But my understanding is that the finished painting is by definition a series of intricate relationships that have all come together. And that if you don't have some part of all those relationships in the painting, as you go along, you don't really know what you're relating to. So like this highlight in relation to, the light on the turnip, that you want to establish, to know how light to make this or how light to make the highlight in relation to each other. So if you don't establish that early on and you just keep doing the painting, you're not really working against a resistance that's going to be there at the end of the painting. So that while you don't have to finish everything as you go along, which in some sense would be very difficult because again you'd be falling into the same trap of finishing something without seeing it in relation to its neighbor or to some other aspect of the painting. So that would be just as bad to just totally finish something. But you have to, as you go along, have enough of the finished painting to tell you about the relationships you're establishing. You know, it's like making little memos, like this highlight in relation to that, or to that, or to the light on the turnip here. Enough at this stage of the painting. You may change, you know, or embroider some of the relationships as you go along, but at least you're trying to work against what you hope the finished painting will have. So each thing that you put down should help you get to the next thing. Like this light, the shadow looked one way without the light on it. With the light on it, it gets into a different feeling of relationship. So that, as I said, you can say the dark should be this value, but until you see it against the light, you're really not sure, you're not making really a statement that has any validity. So everything that's in the painting is in relationship to everything else in the painting. And as I say, so that's why I feel as you go along, you have to finish enough, don't leave certain objects, you know, in a series or by themselves until you can establish or finish it, have some kind of a highlight, in other words, to tell you, to be able to establish a relationship of what the finished painting is going to have. Is that clear? So putting this changes the look of that back there, you see. So each thing, every time you make an advance in the painting, you have to check all the relationships in the painting to that point. So it's almost like doing a jigsaw puzzle, that until you put the final piece in, everything's in a state of flux, which is in a sense one of the difficulties. If you're seeing painting that way as a series of relationships, and each delicate color change or value change has an effect on the entire painting in some fashion. So until it's finished, everything is, in that sense, very loose. You see, then when it's finished, the last piece interlocks everything. You see, so a little bit of a lot of things, and then fine-tuning it, the subtlety. So you start, I mean, this, because the demonstration is a little more finished and faster than I would normally work, you understand. But
Do you ever paint larger canvases, or do you just prefer the smaller ones?
well, no, I do large. I mean, I actually just completed two of the largest still lifes I've painted, and one was 32 by 28, the other was 32 by 26, sort of a matching pair. And those are the largest still lifes I've painted. I've done bigger portraits, the largest being portrait. I did a double wedding portrait, which was 6 feet by 4.5 feet, of John Mellencamp and his his bride. It was a wedding picture, Elaine. So that's the largest canvas I've painted to date. I was at his wedding, and at the reception, John came over and said, "You know, I'd like you to do a painting of the wedding." And he said, "Make it big." Those were his instructions. And he didn't give me any size, just make it big. So it's kind of difficult to figure out what he meant by big. And so I got back to the studio and took some stretcher bars. I started, I think, around 30, 36, and then I just thought, well, that's too long to put in the whole wedding, too small rather, to put in the whole wedding, so I went up to 36, 48, and I just kept loosely putting stretchers together, trying to figure out, you know, what big was. Finally, I got to 6 feet high, and the canvas that I make is roughly, my canvas is 54 inches wide, so that gave me a 6 feet by 4.5 feet canvas. And I figured that it looked like a good proportion. To go larger than 6 feet seemed, it would be get too tall and skinny. So I wound up with a double portrait, 6 feet by 4.5 feet. And as I said, it took me 3 months, a little over 3 months, to do the whole painting.
Is that from photographs?
Partially from photographs, mostly from life. It was from life in the sense that I posed for, I started out with, I called up the photographer who shot the wedding. He sent me all the proofs, and then I picked a couple of headshots and asked him to develop them. And I did the portrait of Elaine and John. I did, you know, from those pictures. And then I used myself for John's body. You know, I put on a white shirt and a dark jacket, and so that was, you know, the rest of the body, the hands were basically from me, from life. The dinner not the dinner table, but the table with all the food and vegetables and all that stuff, I set up with flowers and bottles, you know, everything. Stuffed pig, I made a stuffed pig, a fake stuffed pig, and so that was all done from life. The flowers, some of the background, the trees. It was an outdoor wedding, was done from, you know, made up more or less. I mean, I try to stay with the look of his place. So it was a combination of, but a lot of it, you know, for Elaine, I hired a couple of models to pose for Elaine. So you can see it was a combination of life and photography. I try to do as much from life as possible. And it was quite a project, maneuvering a canvas that big in the studio. It was quite a feat. You know, a lot of times I like to work upside down on a painting because you can see the abstraction of the painting. You could see, you know, how it's working better when it's upside down rather than when it's right side up. When
Do you paint on it
yeah,
upside down?
I paint on it upside down. Yes, a lot of my paintings, portraits or still life, if I just feel the need to get a more abstract, or make sure that it, or sometimes if I'm just having problems with a painting, I'll work on it upside down. And I know it sounds strange, but it's great exercise and it's fun. It's a challenge. It's good. When I was a student in Parsons, when I was in Parsons, we one of my teachers in life drawing class, I just loved this thing. We'd sit in a semicircle around the model, and the teacher would say, draw the model as if you were 3/4 around the other side. So you would have, you'd look at the model in your position and then pick a spot 3/4 around the other side and have to draw it as though you were in that spot. So it was a mind-bending kind of exercise, and then you could, after the pose was over or just before the model would take a break, you could walk over and see how you did. So I just loved stuff like that and after a while you don't think it's such a big deal. And so working upside down, it's the same thing. It just you could get much more abstract and see big shapes and how the color is working without the image interfering with you. So portraits, anything upside down it's just, I tell you, it's just the challenge, the fun of, could I do it? Could you do it? One of the hardest things to do was when they would pose the model over the model stand with the head all the way back, so that you're looking at a head upside down. Now, you're so used to seeing people upright, or maybe their head is tilted, etc., etc. To try to draw a head upside down, that was, in a sense, the most challenging exercise, because you just want to turn your head, you want to look upside down. And you're so familiar with somebody right side up, that was one of the most difficult challenges in that kind of a mind-bending kind of a situation. More than drawing the model 3/4 around the other side was trying to draw someone upside down. Never ever quite got that to a point where I felt comfortable that I was doing good, or getting the features and stuff in the right place. But it's all fun. Okay. Since the first demonstration I did, we did a still life going across the canvas, left to right. I thought I'd set up something that had more of a movement of front to back, just to give you that kind of an idea. In any case, what I try to do is set up something in a sense that starts here with this bunch of grapes and then up to the turnip and then the vase back here with the flowers, to have that kind of a semicircle movement. And starting out, just with drawing the idea of the painting, so that instead of really drawing anything specifically in terms of the objects, but really drawing the idea of the painting. So since we want everything to lead to the back, the idea is to keep everything in the foreground here relatively dark, create more of a shadow so the light works further back in the painting. Now there are two things to consider in learning how to paint, and one is how do you get to paint the objects that you're painting to look at how to get the objects you're painting to look like the objects that are in front of you, which is, I think, what most people start out thinking when they think about learning to paint. And the other is learning to paint by getting a sense of the paint quality.
David, do you ever use sables?
No, I don't. Only when I'm trying to do watercolor, which I do every so often to prove to myself I still can't do watercolor. It's really hard for me to do watercolor. I don't think like a watercolorist, so that even when I'm doing watercolor, I'm still trying to get the paint to be thicker, which of course is not really what you want to do when you're doing a watercolor.
David, would you speak on atmosphere and space and the mystery?
The sweet mystery of life. At last I found you. Atmosphere, in one sense, is holding back something that, when you're, it's of course simply like painting outdoors, where as things go further back, they become vaguer. So if you're painting something that looks black or dark, instead of going to full strength, you hold back a little bit.
Like the Oriental philosophy, where the space is almost more important than the subject matter.
It's the one versus the other, like the painting, which I don't have a reprint, I don't know if any, the Sweet Pea that I did, where it was, another is how much filled space versus how much empty space. But yes, it was like that. It's just empty space versus filled space or how much filled space will admit of how much emptiness and quiet. So it's just an aesthetic problem. The hardest thing is the signing. To make it unobtrusive. Just to find a space to sign something, because you try to account, just what I was saying, for all the filled spaces and empty spaces, and you don't really account for where to sign it. So find a space to sign it where it'll be unobtrusive, since I'm of the unobtrusive signing school. some painters, of course, quite flamboyant in their signature. That's better. Anyhow, you've just been a super audience, and I thank you.
Well, that was David Leffel and the Art of Painting, and you can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, there's a special discount code for today only in the comments section. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.